I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Becoming Technical. This is the first in a three-part series. I'm Abby Graff. I am the Vice President of Programs and Community Engagement at the Nonprofit Alliance, also known as TMPA. We are a membership organization. We work to promote, protect, and strengthen the nonprofit sector. And if you don't already know us and aren't already a member, I hope you will take a look at our website and learn more about our webinars, our conferences, our programming and education, as well as the advocacy and legislative work that we do on behalf of the nonprofit sector. So that's www.tnpa.org. Again, you can find more information on our website. So again, welcome to today's webinar, Becoming Technical. This is the first in a three-part series. It's presented by TMPA, and we're grateful to have Amazon Web Services for Nonprofits, AWS, as our co-presenters here. This series is designed as a conversation about technology in our sector, particularly designed for the non-technical leader. Today's webinar and Thursday's webinar are set up more webinar style. We'll be presenting a lot of information in conversational style. Please do participate in the chat as you have questions, insights, want to connect with your fellow participants. Next Tuesday's section, so the third in the three-part series, is an interactive workshop that you'll be able to bring your specific challenges that you're facing. I do want to take a second to thank you, the participants, and applaud you really for investing in this conversation. It's not always easy to tackle areas of expertise that are not our own. And I think we're all in a situation where we know we need to, and we have this technology conversation that we're swimming in. So really tackling it, diving in, and becoming comfortable with it isn't always easy, but is an important thing to do. So welcome and give yourself a pat on the back for that. So we are so happy to have Amazon Web Services for Nonprofits here with us, AWS, that they agreed to engage in this conversation, particularly for nonprofits. And with that, I want to in particular thank Kelly Hecht, a good friend and long history in the nonprofit sector. She's here with us from AWS. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to her to introduce herself and Rich. Awesome. See you in the chat, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Abby. And thank you everyone for being here, and TMPA for giving us a reason to come together. Rich and I are both really excited for this conversation. Becoming technical is sort of a ubiquitous phrase, right? What does that even mean? Some of those things are what we're going to explore together. I really appreciate the fact that you guys have invested an hour of your time in this today, especially at the beginning of the year, and a year that is looking to be pretty complicated for us to continue to navigate as marketers and fundraisers and organizational leaders. I was really excited when I looked through the list of registrants for today. Not only are there some exceptional individuals on here that I've known and worked with for a lot of years, so I'm excited to be back in company with you all, but there is a nearly 50-50 mix of leaders from the organizational side of our business and leaders from the agency side of our business. Which is particularly exciting because the relationship that we have as partners in this work and the role that technology plays in all of our efforts collectively is incredibly important. So the conversation that we're going to have today is really going to start with grounding some definitions, taking some terms that have been thrown around and are used pretty frequently, and giving them some substance and some clarity. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of three real world examples that I've seen pretty frequently over the years. So hopefully they will feel familiar to you all in your organizations. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time hearing from Rich, who's going to introduce himself in a little bit, really to talk about the journey that he has experienced and share the insights as a technical leader that will be helpful for some of my non-technical peers out in the space. So with that, as Abby mentioned, my name is Kelly Hecht. I work with a division of Amazon called Amazon Web Services, or AWS. And more specifically, I am part of about 150 leaders that are dedicated exclusively to how the cloud benefits the work that nonprofit organizations are doing specifically. It is probably no secret to anyone who's known me a long time that it was somewhat of a surprise to people who've known me that I went to work for the world's most comprehensive and broadly adopted cloud technology provider, AWS, because a year ago, I really honestly could not have answered this question. What is the cloud? I had heard the term, I had read about it. I probably even used it in meetings, but if I'm being really honest, I didn't have a true understanding of what it was, how it was different, and I don't know that I fully understood the value that it could offer to the clients that I was serving on the agency side of the work I did, or when I was at the American Cancer Society leading actual programs. So in the event that you are somewhere on the spectrum from also not being able to answer this question to being able to answer it really well, we're going to start on the spectrum of people who may not feel as comfortable with this language. If this is something you feel like you know inside and out, feel free to multitask, and we'll let you know when it's time to come back to us. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is start with the actual formal definition. What is the cloud? Now, I'm starting with this definition not necessarily for its clarity or its simplicity, especially not to a non-technical leader, but actually because these are the terms that are used commonly, and I want to make sure that these look familiar to people as they go through the world. These are terms that we are going to see, and we want to have a better understanding of what they really mean. So the formal definition is that the cloud offers web-based delivery of IT resources and applications via the internet. Okay, so if we sort of unpack that, web-based simply means we access it from a URL or maybe an app, something in the web, and the resources and applications are what we see when we've arrived there. So those may be dashboards, those may be login screens or portals or things of that nature. If we think about this in a real world experience, my guess is that Netflix is something that many of you have used. Airbnb is probably something that you have used, Lyft, Salesforce, and perhaps you have shopped at Amazon. These are all great examples of the cloud in our practical life and things that we use almost now without even giving it credit or realizing the way that it's embedded in the way that we exist and go through the world. So let's use Netflix as a real life example. Web-based is the part where you access it through the URL or more likely the app that you've downloaded on your phone or your iPad or your computer. You have a secure login, right? You have your username and password that makes sure it's you. When you log in, you see a login screen that has your personal information, your preferences. It may have family members. If you're like me, you've spent some time laughing and picking which avatar you're going to have be associated with your name. All of those elements are elements behind the cloud, right? You have millions and millions of shows and movies, right? That storage capability of all of that content is part of the cloud. And then ultimately, at the end there, you also have what many people associate with Amazon and with AWS is the recommendation engine. So if you liked this movie, you might like this as well. All of those elements are inherent to the cloud and are examples that we use in our day-to-day life. The fun thing about this is that all of these companies that are listed here, these brands, Netflix, Airbnb, Lyft, NASA, we could go on, right? It's the same technology for them that it is for your organization. There is not a different cloud for Netflix that there is for you. It's just how we use it. And so the purpose really of today is to understand what these elements are, not just from the lens of how companies and brands that we interact with day in and day out are using them, but to really get clear on which parts would add value to the work that we're doing as a marketer or fundraiser, or maybe the head of field operations, and which parts maybe we aren't quite ready for so that we are more knowledgeable as leaders ourselves. So we've talked a little bit here about things that are familiar to us as a consumer, right? Ways that we as a person going through life have benefited from the cloud. Now let's put our hat on a little bit differently and think about why do these companies and other companies that we know choose to use the cloud? Why would your organization choose to adopt some or part or all of elements of your program into the cloud? There are three primary reasons that an organization or a company will choose to use the cloud. The first is savings. There is usually a significant cost savings because it is a variable expense. And we're going to talk about what I mean by that in a minute. You have the ability to scale, which means if you're a big org, you can use a lot of the cloud. If you're a really small org, you can just use a little bit of the cloud. If you have an unexpected pop and you need to be bigger for a moment in time, you can do that, right? So the ability to expand and contrast nearly real time is incredibly valuable to companies that are using technology in the cloud, and can be very valuable to our nonprofit partners as well. And the last one is becoming more and more important, which is the superior experiences that we offer in our case to our constituents, our members, our donors, our mission recipients, and our patients. For years, we have talked about donor experience, a 360 view, donor-centric fundraising, right? All terms that we have strived to achieve in our efforts. And there's a lot within the cloud that can help us do that. But it's really important in order to benefit from those elements that we understand what they are, what they aren't, and what's entailed with them. One really helpful analogy that was offered to me in my early days that I'll share with you guys, especially for those that may be a little bit more new to these concepts, is really to think about the cloud as electricity. So you may remember, I just showed the name Salesforce, right? And it's not uncommon when I'll talk to someone, they'll say, oh, we're already in the cloud, we're using Salesforce. That's correct, but perhaps in a different way than people think. The cloud in AWS is the electricity that powers your Salesforce instance. So if you're on Salesforce, you are using AWS as cloud. You're just using it as the electricity behind the scenes. So similar to electricity, you pay for what you use, right? You turn on all the lights in your house, you're going to pay a little bit more that month. You're on vacation, you might pay a little bit less. That flexible scaling is a real inherent part of the way that the cloud can help support organizations, and in particular comes into play around the savings part. So an example in our industry that's used pretty frequently is around year end. Right? Hopefully everyone is celebrating the last few weeks, that we're busy and vibrant and full of generosity, which is a time where we may need to open our aperture a little bit more, use a little bit more electricity, but maybe on an average Sunday in March, we don't need that much, right? So our ability to expand and contrast is really important for how we think about using these capabilities in the way that we go about managing our businesses. So some people might wonder why we would decide to have this conversation without having our IT leaders on the phone. Rich being a humble exception because he wears many hats. But really a lot of the conversation that we're looking to facilitate today, and the reason that we've asked Rich to join us in sharing his perspective, is because for many years, it has been perceived that cloud and technology is an IT function. And as a marketer and as a fundraiser, I used to wait for my technology team to bring me things, or at times if I needed something, I felt that I was limited based on where my IT team was in their roadmap. The reality is we now live in a world where technology is all around us everywhere. It is all of our jobs at different points of the day. So the goal through these conversations today, Thursday, and then ultimately next week is to ensure that leaders across the entire organization have a deep understanding of what the basics of cloud technology are and how it relates to your business. If you're in fundraising, if you're in marketing, if you're in field support, there's probably many others that are not listed here. We want you to be able to be your own internal advocate of what you need, and to create healthy boundaries around tools and technology and elements of the cloud that you may not need yet. It will build a healthier relationship and partnership with IT, and it will allow you to lead your business more fully. And you'll be in great company because we have more than 7,500 government agencies, 14,000 educational institutions, and about 85,000 nonprofit organizations that currently use the AWS cloud. I was fascinated when I saw this number to learn that a little less than half of those 85,000 are teeny tiny orgs too, organizations that raise less than $1 million a year. So that sort of perspective that the cloud might be expensive or that we're not big enough or we don't have enough data, all misperceptions that we're hoping to be able to educate people on over these next couple of days so that you can really determine for yourself what is the best way to adopt the cloud into your world. All right, so let's get into some definitions real quickly before we invite Rich to start to share some of his expertise. So 3 challenges that if you've worked in this industry for longer than a couple days, you have likely heard one of your colleagues said, or you may have even have said yourself. A desire to have a 360 view of your constituent or your data. The ability to have integrated data is something that we have long known we needed. Celebrate so many of the agencies that are on the call today having worked really hard to make this inherent to the way that they lead their partners, and also really celebrate a lot of organizational leaders who are working really hard to prioritize and manage their data programs so that they can get closer to the 360 view. Then it's the question of how do we make use of that data, right? It's not perfect, it's not clean, it doesn't always have great hygiene, there's duplicates, we're missing data pieces. Oftentimes I hear leaders feel a little bit paused around their ability to make decisions and move forward with the data they have, even once they have started to integrate it, because they worry that the integrity of the data won't be where it should be. And the third one I hear about is organizations really wanting to elevate the experiences that they provide. We all know the old moniker of relevant, personal, and timely. It's still very true, but it's even more than that, right? The lines between a consumer experience and a nonprofit have started to blend. And so all kidding aside, people really do look for what they experience when they shop on Amazon or they use Netflix. And they often want that as part of their philanthropic experience. So how do we start to provide more of that in a way that we can afford and that we can sustain as organizational leaders? So I picked these 3 because they're 3 really common ones. And they also relate to 3 terms relative to the cloud that are often misunderstood that we're going to use to define today. So I'm sure you have heard the term data lake. You may have heard the phrase data house, data lake house, data pond. I've started using the phrase data puddle. And those are all terms that are commonly used that can help us get closer to a 360 view. So we're going to define that, and then we're going to invite Rich to talk a little bit about that as well. He's going to give you a new one, data swamp, which I love. Then we're going to talk about the ubiquitous AI and machine learning, right? Not new, certainly not new to our sector, but often something that can be a little bit misunderstood. So we're really going to try to ground the definitions so that we know what we're talking about and that you can determine how and where those apply to you. For both the data lake and machine learning, we're going to get really deep into those on Thursday with 2 speakers as well. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that conversation as well. And then lastly, elevated experiences. How are we segmenting? How are we personalizing? How are we using automation? And how can the cloud help us do that in a way that's more effective and efficient? So to start with the definitions, again, I'm going to keep them actually really formal intentionally so that they're familiar when you see them. So a data lake allows you to store all your structured and unstructured data in one centralized repository at any scale. With a data lake, you can store your data as is without having to first structure the data based on potential questions that you may have in the future. So reading that, it's no wonder that there could be some confusion around what this might be. The best way to think about this is that you can store data in any form, as much or as little as you want, in a place where you can ask questions of the data. A couple things to keep in mind here, okay? Your data is stored as is. That is the difference between structured and unstructured data. Structured data means all the files and formats are the exact same. Unstructured means it's a little bit of the wild, wild west, right? A data lake allows you to use unstructured data. Conversely, a data warehouse does require the data to be structured. So that's why there can be some benefits of the data lake for many organizations first. The second piece of that is that it's one centralized repository, right? It does not require you to centralize all of your data. If I'm in charge of fundraising, I might just need 2 or 3 data sources brought together. I might need my peer-to-peer events, my direct response, and my gala data. That might be enough for me to get a better view of the people that I'm talking to while I work towards a truly integrated 360 view. And last, but definitely not least, a data lake does not replace your CRM, okay? It is something that is pulled out, you ask questions of it, and then your CRM is protected. And yes, in a more advanced environment, there are times where you can bring information back into your CRM, but for a starting point, you're really using the data lake as a place to a little bit like a sandbox. Make a mess with your data, ask some questions of it, get some better information and intelligence, and then you can move on. So with that, really quickly through the last 3, because we're going to spend most of the time today on the data lake, often because it's a good starting point. Data analytics, again, official definition, converts raw data into actionable insights. Many of your agency partners, many of the folks on the phone are providing this. This is fantastic. I've been thrilled to see more and more adoption around this. There are ways that the cloud can help accelerate it and augment it, and that's all great. You could do it with your agency partner. You can do it on your own. Artificial intelligence is the field of computer science dedicated to solving cognitive problems commonly associated with human intelligence, such as learning, problem solving, and patterns, right? So the best way to think about this is a website chatbot that you may have experienced or some user-generated content. Those are all ways that AI is being applied. And then machine learning is a very specific type of that. So it's the science of algorithms and statistical models that a computer system uses to perform tasks without explicit instructions relying on patterns. So you can think of a recommendation engine, right? Like we talked about with Netflix or with Amazon, or experience pathways. So those are great ways that you can think about all 3 of those elements. So I recognize that there is a ton of questions in the chat. I assure you that whether it is on today's call or after, we will get to them. But without further ado, I want to take a minute and I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see more of Rich and start to ask some questions of him. So Rich, go ahead and start by telling us a little bit about you and your background and what led you to your current role.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. I'm really excited to be here with everyone today. For those who don't know me, my name is Rich Castro. I'm the Chief Information Officer here at Share Our Strength. We're a nonprofit based in DC working to end childhood hunger or end hunger here at the US and abroad. I've been at Share Our Strength for about 5 years, but I didn't really grow up in the nonprofit sector, professionally speaking. My career has actually taken me, I think, throughout most of the sectors in the workforce. So I started in politics, where I was in the White House. I spent time in the national security space as a consultant to places like the National Security Agency, the FBI, and the DIA. I spent time in the military. I deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've even spent time commercially before I was at Share Our Strength. I was at Capital One Bank working on cybersecurity issues over there. So I've gotten the chance to look at IT and IT strategy through the lens of a couple different stakeholders. And just, to me, it's been really insightful and informative as to the more things change, the more they stay the same. It really is some of the same challenges. And to me, that's useful grounding for when we often hear, well, this is what the private sector does, or this is, this is how another organization does it. And really, we're all trying to figure it out together. But it's useful to kind of take some of the attitudes and lessons learned across organizational boundaries or across sector boundaries. So happy to be here and share those.
It's incredibly helpful to hear you say that everyone struggles, because we certainly feel it in a meaningful way in the work that we do. Tell us a little bit about what surprised you most when you came to the nonprofit sector, having worked in all of those other sectors in technology, about the way that our industry uses technology, or maybe doesn't use technology. Was there anything that really stood out to you?
Yeah, and I think that was one of the first places where I need to adopt a little bit more humility when I joined my current organization. I came from Capital One, which is an organization that touts itself as a technology company that happens to do banking. Before that, I was, I did things at the National Security Agency, which ingests more data than all our organizations combined in a year. They do that every hour. So they massive troves of data and data science, and technology is at the heart of is an appreciated heart of their mission. And when I came to the nonprofit sector, that wasn't my experience here. The IT teams tend to self-select, many of them, not all of them, self-select into being the people that manage your computer, manage your email, maybe keep the conference rooms up and running, but they're not considered a business partner in solving the challenges of the mission for many of the organizations I've dealt with or that I've interacted with. And I think that's a mistake, just bluntly. I think that there's IT teams think about the problems that organizations face fundamentally differently. They use a different set of vocabularies. And when we talk about diversity in thinking, it's, that's what we want. We want people who are not looking at the problem the same way, who are going to have to struggle a little bit to use a common vocabulary, because that's how we're going to get a nuanced understanding of meaning.
So you make a great point there. There are a lot of IT leaders that focus on infrastructure, right? So storage, computer hookups, right? Sort of the bread and butter of IT. And then there is what probably is considered a more innovative side of IT, right? Where we are testing and trying new things. We're building new apps. We're building new websites. It's more of the consumer facing or constituent facing. Talk to us a little bit about how you see those two worlds structured in nonprofit versus others. Is it usually the same? Are they divided? Do we have one, not the other? Or is it pretty similar?
Yeah, well, so I think it's actually my vertical does itself no justice, but with the name that it's chosen of information technology, because we tend to focus on the technology side. We tend to focus on those magic black boxes that are on people's desktops or in the server closet, and we think that's what the IT team does. They do the technology side. I think one of the things that I did differently at Share Our Strength is I focused on the information side. And information is not only the thing that travels across the medium of that magic black box, but it is also the way that we think about decisions. It is what we are craving to make decisions. It is the way that it's the currency that different departments use to transact business with each other. And so if your IT team or if your organization can think of the role of IT as being responsible for the flow of information, not the management of technology, it really does reframe the job pretty substantially. Because then my job is to understand the business processes. Well, what are the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve? How can we think about those differently? Who else is doing something similar that we might be able to apply lessons learned across? Once we know the business outcomes, the business processes, the data that's involved, the last thing we do is we then employ technology to automate that and to do that again and again and make it easier. But so many teams just start with the technology side, and so they're out of step, and they're not welcomed into the conversation earlier on.
That's a great insight. And I hope that's something that everyone wrote down. Information is what he said to lead with. And I love that because it also puts everyone on the same side of the table, because every department, every team, every leader out there is on a quest for information that allows them to be more effective in delivering their outcomes, right? And so if we are all on the same quest for information, right, it again then puts us all on the same team, as opposed to sometimes there can be, dare we say, some conflict, Rich, between the two teams.
Can't have a fire without a little bit of spark and friction.
A healthy spark, right? Okay, that's amazing. I'd love you to share also, what do you think are some misperceptions that you can use me as your example? I'm a non-technical leader, 20 years proudly. What are some misperceptions that people maybe like me have around technology, IT, the cloud in general, that would be beneficial for us to understand more correctly?
Yes, a great question, because I want to use back one of your examples from before, but it goes back to that distinction between information and technology. If we're focusing on technology, then the challenge is that it's always someone else's job, and generally someone who doesn't understand what you're trying to achieve. But if we focus on the information, then it's something that we can solve together. And I'll use the example of Netflix that you were using before just a minute ago. If we think about it from the technology perspective, the way that I think it's wrong, then if you want to watch a movie, you're probably going to have to ask your executive assistant or maybe your kids to go search that thing called Netflix and go pull up that movie. And it's a stupid, horrible way of trying to watch a movie because you're dependent on someone else. They're pulling the information for you. You are just looking at them and wondering why the hell do they keep using that remote? It doesn't make any sense. However, if you recognize that part of the new way of working is that it's your job to understand the way that information flows, it's your job to understand some of that technology, then you're the one who's going to be working on Netflix, and you're the one who's going to be choosing what movie to watch. And it's so much faster. You're not dependent on the other people to do it. Technologies today are really centered around user experiences. Those who build technologies really want you to use the technology directly. They don't want someone else to use it on your behalf. And so I think the challenge in the sector is that we're not always there yet. We still think that I need a team to pull this for me. I need someone else to do this for me because I'm a fundraiser, I'm an HR professional, I'm a legal counsel. I'm going to have my team pull that for me. And I really want to break away from that. I want us to get to the place where we're pulling the information ourselves. Because then you're going to run into things, again, staying with the Netflix example of the recommendation engine and think, oh, there's things out there that I didn't know about. Oh, there's capabilities here that I didn't know about. If we're relying on others to interact with technology on our behalf, the results we get are limited to what we've asked for as opposed to what's out there.
Would you say, though, in that environment, it's also helpful for everyone to understand what information they're seeking? Like, even because, listen, there's some organizations where pulling my own information is not yet, we're not there yet, right? And there'll be some organizations where pulling that information may not be in the foreseeable future. So to allow this to be more beneficial is an interim step just to make sure that everyone knows which information they seek or desire or would benefit from having at their disposal on a regular basis?
Yeah, and I think that's the opportunity for collaboration and conversation between people who you might not be speaking with on a day-to-day basis, talking about what it is that you'd like to accomplish as opposed to what you are working on, because we all want to be in the problem-solving space, not in the complaining about the things that aren't working space. So talking about what's happening or what you would like to happen is a great place to start. I'm kind of reminded of an article I read a couple of years ago about the problem of IT systems, which is that organizations will spend the equivalent of 1, 2, 3, 5 people's salaries to implement a significant new tool. And then it just kind of sits there. And the article made the point of, think of this as a person. If we just hired this $1 million employee or this person that makes some factor of your salary, and so they're introduced at the all hands meeting and everyone says hi and welcomes them. And then they just sit there in the corner and no one goes up and talks to them. No one interacts with them. No one engages with them. No one figures out what this person is really good at because it's all they care about is that they're doing their job. And I wish that person would understand what I'm doing. That's not the way that we want to interact with people. And if we change the paradigm a little bit and say, well, that's also not how we should be interacting with our tools. We need to go out and proactively engage with them and see what they're good at. And so we can. It's
such a powerful visual. And of course, I happen to love Office Space, so I can't help but thinking of that movie as you use that analogy. Yep. And on the flip side of it, the other piece of it I see is having watched people find the right recipe for where and how the cloud can impact their programs. It's also like putting someone in a car versus having them walk, right? Because on the one hand, we shouldn't waste things. And on the other hand, when we can move from point A to point B in such a faster, more efficient way, it's a bummer to see that we aren't taking advantage of that. So let me ask you that. My observation in having met with a lot of leaders over the years is that there's something that I would almost describe as a little bit of fear or hesitation in adopting technology. And sometimes that's because of historical experiences of being sold a fancy widget that didn't perform. In other cases, it's a perception of expense or a lack of internal acumen. Do you have any insights from where you sit and having led Share Our Strength, still leading them through their journey, as to ways that that leaders can sort of acknowledge and break through things that might be holding them back from finding technologies that would put them in the car instead of walking?
Yeah, no. So the first thing that I noticed when I joined the nonprofit sector is that we tend to approach conversations about technology with a scarcity mindset. We're all focused on, not incorrectly, but we're all focused on using donor dollars to achieve, to feed kids, to solve environmental challenges, to whatever our mission is. We want to make sure that as much of those dollars get directly to that end state. And so it really then creates that scarcity mindset where we don't want to invest too much in our operations. And I would challenge that, and I have challenged that a little bit with saying, instead of thinking about technology as something that takes away from our mission, I really look at it as how can we optimize the delivery of our mission values? So we at Share Our Strength, we're able to do so much more once we bought new computers when I first joined that weren't crashing every couple minutes. And it's so silly, but it is like, how much time are we wasting rebooting computers? How much time are we wasting on calls that won't work? How much time are we wasting on using 100 megabyte Excel spreadsheets when we could spend so much less time if we just invested in how to do that a little bit wiser? And when I think about this, there's 3 tests that I tend to offer up that we've kind of adopted here inside Share Our Strength. When we're looking at whether or not something is working, the first test is, do we have the right technology? And that's pretty much where people stop. But it's the obvious question. Do we want to do something? Do we have the technology that's designed to do that? Second test, is it properly configured? And I have often found that if we spend a little bit of time, and this is why those business owners need to get under the hood of their technology a little bit, it's not that the technology is broken, it's just that it wasn't set up to do what you're asking it to do, but it's perfectly capable if you're willing to articulate those business needs. And the third one is the staff trained to do it? Because so much of our technology is the right technology, is perfectly capable, and I can't get my major gift officers to enter in the data the way that they need to, or I can't get
hypothetically speaking.
Hypothetically, making something up. So if we can solve those 3 problems, do we have the right technology in place? Is it properly configured, and have we trained our staff? That increases the success rate of technology exponentially.
Right.
And that will then really help get over that mindset. Well, technology just never works for us because we're not investing in it.
And I love that, because those are 3 really important questions to ask ourselves, right? And to explore. It also facilitates good conversation amongst, to your point, people that aren't often talking. I wonder too if there isn't a step before that, right? Which is, what am I telling myself about what can or can't happen in my organization, right? There is, especially for those of us that have been doing this work a long time, our experienced instincts are both a blessing and a curse. They are things that have been incredibly powerful in allowing us to make great real-time decisions, to do more with less. And there's also a lot of muscle memory in there, right? And the world has changed so dramatically that, if I use myself as an example, I remember launching one of the first online fundraising platforms for a peer-to-peer event at the beginning of my career, right? What went into that versus what goes into it today are wildly different, right? The choices of who I could work with then, the choices of who I could work with now are wildly different. So I love those 3. And if I may be so presumptuous as to add a 0 one before the 3, it's to just write down the things that you're wondering, right? Go back to that information question. What are you wondering if it was possible? What are you wondering if it does or doesn't work? What are you imagining is the reason you can't do something, right? And if you put those down on paper and have those conversations.
So Kelly was leading up to a question there that that I've missed here for a second. But I see Kathy asking, can I repeat the three things as Kelly comes back and joins us? So the three things that Kelly's first one, the 0 point, is write down what it is that you're trying to accomplish. The act of writing something down helps really crystallize and clarify that thought. And it also then makes it easy to have a conversation with someone that you might not normally have with. The second one is asking yourself, do you actually have the technology in place? Do you have the right technology in place? It is really hard to manage a customer relationship if you don't have a CRM in place. It is really hard to visualize data if you don't have a Tableau or a Power BI in place. So you do need to get some of that basic technology in place. Next is the technology properly configured? This is something that I've seen over and over again, and something that we've worked through deeply at Share Our Strength, or we're continuing to work through. We implemented the technology to solve a certain problem at one point. We've advanced, we've become more sophisticated. The technology is still good, but it's not configured to the way that we want. And so having that thorough re-examination, is it configured to my current needs? And the last one, staff training. It is a far cheaper solution to spend time training your staff on how to use the technology they have than to do an implementation of something new that, by the way, you're going to have to train them on how to use anyway. So those are the 4 points reiterated there.
Great one. Thanks for everyone navigating the technology with us. How ironic, right? The other thing that I would augment to that, Rich, is that to the point that I'm not sure if people heard I was making about how things have evolved over the last 5, 10, 20 years. A lot of folks I meet with today don't have rich in-house technology capabilities. Like I work with a number of customers today who, candidly, they don't even have in-house IT teams. And you heard me mention earlier that those 85,000 customers on AWS today, many of them don't even raise $1 million annually. So they certainly don't have robust teams. So for organizations to find the flexibility that allows them to adopt technology in the cloud in a way that remains relevant, right, for them, have you seen some examples of that? Do you have some encouraging words for folks that don't have a rich leading their IT teams?
So I would say that one of the things, you're absolutely right that the world, I think, the world of computing is fundamentally different from 5, 6 years ago. The level of capability that we're now able to get to use is so much. It's just fun. I keep saying that word. It's just, there's a fundamental difference. When I started, there was, and COVID was a great proof of this, by the way. When I started, all our technology was what we call on-prem, meaning that you had to be in the office to access the CRM. You had to be on the network to do almost anything. Many of us had desktop computers, so you couldn't work from home. You couldn't do anything like that. And then we slowly, going up until COVID, we're starting to move towards the cloud, which allowed us to work with anyone from anywhere at any time. COVID forced us all to get over that final hurdle. But now we can have, because our CRM is cloud-based, we can have our major gift officer on their phone looking at the donor's record on the way to the meeting to remind themselves of whatever happened. They can also, on the way out of the meeting, type in their notes into their online CRM, into their cloud-based CRM. I mean, that's just an example for this group, but there's the fact that we could do almost anything outside the office at this point means that we're really not tied to the office, so we can operate where we need to be.
It's a great point. And I think that comes as both the presentation of what's possible and candidly as a little bit of a reminder on our shoulders of what's expected, right? And I find myself thinking about the term relevancy a lot right now, because there is such a heightened expectation around the type of experience that we deliver to our staff, to our donors, to our board members, to our mission recipients, and understanding how we remain relevant is really going to require us not to figure out everything that we need to do, right? But what are the bits and pieces out there that exist that are intrinsic to our ability to stay relevant in a world that is simply technology forward, right? And I think the cloud offers a lot of flexibility around that, which again is why we're really focused on making sure that people understand it, so that they can make educated decisions around what they need and don't need. So with that, you introduced me to the phrase data swamp, which I loved, which I'm now adding to my collection of data insert blank language. Talk to us a little bit. We're going to hear a lot about data lakes and AI and machine learning on Thursday. Talk to us a little bit about your experience with integrating data and a little bit around what a data swamp is from your perspective.
Sure. So I'm going to not disagree at all with the definition that you provide, but I'm going to provide a visual definition of a data lake. So if you have your data lake, it's a lake, and you have data streams, which, think of a map of all the streams that are flowing into that lake, feeding it with all sorts of rich information. So what could your streams be? You could have your ECRM, your Illuminate equivalent. You could have your CRM, your Razor's Edge equivalent. You could have your general ledger system. You could have your expense system. You could have all these things flowing into your data lake. And then you can walk off the data, what I consider like a pier. You can dip your bucket in, and you can pull up all the richness of the different data streams that are there together. So if that's our visual, a data swamp is when you just have too much stuff flowing into that lake. And so sometimes one of the challenges that I've seen, and I think I was guilty of this too, when we first started implementing the data lake, was, all right, well, let's get all the data in. So that way, then we can figure out what we need to do with it. And I think that was just wrong. Fundamentally, that was one of my big learnings. I think that it's better to start with what is the problem that I have at hand. Let me get the data that I need, and let me put it into the data lake. And let's just get those few fields. And then I'm going to move on to my next problem, and I'm going to populate that data lake. And I'm going to continue to do that. And since I'm continuing to populate the same data lake, now my data becomes richer and richer and richer, but each data is there with purpose. If you don't do that up front, then you're just entering in all the data, and it just becomes impossible to navigate. So real world example, we are integrating our CRM into our data lake. There are hundreds of tables in our commercially provided CRM. I have no desire to understand what each of those thousands of fields in those hundreds of tables mean. And in fact, we found that it's very, very difficult because the field names in the back end are different than the field names that the user sees up front. So someone might say, I want a source ID, and it's actually called something else in the back end. So it becomes very difficult. So don't implement everything, but find the problem that you're trying to solve. That first thing, that item 0 that Kelly mentioned, write it down, figure out your strategy for where those data elements are, input them into your data lake, rinse and repeat. Do that again, and your data lake will grow naturally that way without becoming overwhelmed and overburdened with information that you don't know how to use.
I love this, mostly because I think for myself a year ago, thinking back and many years before that, one of my misperceptions of a data lake was that it did need to have all the streams flowing in, right? And so permission from a leader like you who has broad experience and has applied it in our sector to think about, coming back to your word information, what is the information I need and want to have that would allow me to deliver better results, experiences, metrics, et cetera, right? Whether it be the agency delivering for their customer or whether it be a customer delivering it for their constituent. I think permission to start with a few of those things over time, and then the visual that by doing so, the data naturally starts to improve itself, right? Is literally, the first time you said it to me, I could feel my shoulders relax. So I hope others on the call are having that as well. Rich, there's a good real-time question happening around a data mesh, another data term. I don't know if you're interested in speaking to that, or if we should follow up with Michaela after.
Michaela, why don't we follow up afterwards on that?
Yeah, can be a complicated answer, as all these things are. As we're sort of winding down, I would love to hear from you. One of the reasons for the folks that are with us that we asked Rich to join us today is because, as Rich mentioned, he comes with a strong IT background, but not necessarily with a nonprofit background. And since joining Share Our Strength, they really are setting an incredible example as it relates to collaborating across teams. Going back to that visual where you saw the cloud in the middle and all the different departments and leaders around, Rich really has been an IT leader who brings people in conversation, seeks to understand the information they're learning, and invites the same of them. I'd love for you to share with us, knowing that there are mostly non-technical leaders on the phone today, what is something that you would advise for us to consider, or an action we should take, or a conversation that might be worth instigating with our technology leaders, internally or externally, that would help us all move forward in a unified direction?
So you asked me this question before we got together, and I've been mulling over what is the perfect answer. So to me, I'll praise back to AWS or Amazon for a moment. I understand one of the things that you guys do as a corporate best practice is at the beginning of any project, you write out the press release of what the project's what the change in the world was as a result of the project. Yep. That's such a powerful exercise to go through, to think about, well, what am I really doing here that someone else cares about? Doing that exercise, or a similar, like doing a project charter where I don't care about the writing of the project charter. The point of the project charter is to do two things. The first is to write down what exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve. Because as we work on a project, we've all done this, that problem tends to evolve. And so therefore it's never fully successful because you're always chasing a moving target. But if you take the time to say, this is what we're trying to do with this project, that's really helpful. And two, whose job is it to decide when it's successful? That's the other role of the project charter, because there's going to be all sorts of good stakeholders involved with different ambitions and needs. But ultimately, there needs to be one person whose job it is to declare a success. And so either of those functions, either where you collectively write out a press release that you define success from the beginning of how the world is going to change, or you define a project charter where you say, this is the person who's empowered to say, yes, this project is successful, we're going to move on to the next one now. Either of those two is really, really important, because it allows you to then have an honest conversation across departments, whether that's with your IT team or your communications team, or whatever the problem is that you're trying to solve. Having a common understanding of that problem is, to me, the biggest barrier to success. I had an old boss who one time told me again and again, getting the question right is the hard part. Once you do that, the answer is easy. And what, that's my guiding mantra to my team today. We spend time getting the question right, because the answer is easy once you agree on the question.
Yeah, that is a great one. And to your point, you talked earlier about the way that teams can just to talk with their IT teams, right? I would layer into that advice you just gave from your mentor. Not coming to your IT team with what you need from a technology perspective, but to stay as long as you can focused on the problem. What is the challenge that you are facing, right? I think one of the things that I love about the diversity of leadership I see across our sector today, particularly at this moment in time, is that when we really bring the full richness of everyone's backgrounds, right, and taking you as a great example, how we think through a problem can be so much more powerful than if we're just responding to a specific solution, right? Can we do this, yes or no? but to sit in the curiosity of the problem and get that question right is really not as easy as you sometimes think it is. So it's a great reminder.
And that's, to me, again, empowering and expecting, two sides of the same coin, your IT team to sit in that information space as opposed to the technology space. Let us be your partner in that, and the conversation will be different.
A great point. And we've got a lot of leaders on the phone today, right? Your sphere of influences are all very different. Having sat on the agency side for a number of years, right? There's an incredible respect that comes with being an agency partner. And also having sat in the organization side for a number of years, there can be some important influence that we can lead at all levels of our organization. And so today started with hopefully some good grounding and some good definitions. As Abby has noted, we will be sharing this recording. We will also be sharing some of the definitions that we covered today and some highlights from the conversation between Rich and myself. We'll be following up with folks who entered questions that weren't addressed in the chat so that you get your answers. To give you an expectation of what's to come in parts 2 and 3, part 2 will be similar to this. We're going to be joined by 2 different leaders, one from Save the Children and one from Stop Soldier Suicide, who are going to speak like Rich very candidly to experiences they have had and are having, one in advancing forward with the creation of a data lake, and the other with adoption of machine learning to help address a problem they had identified on the mission side. Wanted to let you guys know that the reason we selected these 2 leaders is because they're not done. This is not going to be a big fancy case study with the perfect red bow on the end telling you that it's all easy and done with, but we're going to sort of get into some of the challenges. How did they get started? How did they break through conversations internally? How did they consider objections and determine whether those were things that should stop them before they move forward? So I really do hope you'll join us on Thursday and invite others as well, because I think that conversation is going to be very interesting and undoubtedly will allow every leader to take something away to the work that you're doing and the challenges that stand before you for 2023. So with that, I hope to see you guys on Thursday. Rich, thank you so very much for sharing your insights. Abby and TMPA, thank you for giving us this platform to have today's conversation. I really hope it was valuable to everyone on the call.
Kelly and Rich, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience and the questions that we're all still grappling with. This has been really fabulous. But thank you, everybody. As we said, great to have you here. Thank you, especially Kelly and Amazon Web Services and Rich from Share Our Strength. Really appreciate you being here.